70-80% of Israelis understand what's going on, are afraid for the future of Israel's democracy, are against Netanyahu and his government and his policies, and it's very clear that Netanyahu is not going to listen.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, MEI's managing editor.
On today's episode, we'll be discussing the challenges facing the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, at home and abroad, as he heads to Washington to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump. Amid an ongoing personal corruption trial and a widening investigation of his aides, Netanyahu has taken steps that critics say could undermine Israeli democracy and rule of law. This comes as the war in Gaza has reignited, dozens of Israeli hostages remain in Hamas's hands, and the Israeli military is carrying out operations in the West Bank, Lebanon, and Syria. What is Netanyahu's endgame, and where does Israel go from here? You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please do check out MEI's other podcasts as well, including Rethinking Democracy with Gunul Tol and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Our guest today, Eran Etzion, is an associate fellow at MEI. Eran was a diplomat and strategist with more than 20 years of experience in senior government positions. He was head of policy planning at Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and deputy head of the National Security Council in the Prime Minister's office. It's a pleasure to have you on the program, Eran.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks.
So let's dive into the questions right away here. Israel is in a very different place now compared to the start of the year. 3.5 months on, the ceasefire in Gaza has fallen apart and the one in Lebanon is hanging on by a thread. And domestically, Prime Minister Netanyahu has taken steps to tighten his hold on power. Can you describe for the listeners what situation Israel finds itself in today, politically, regionally, and in the security space? And what has happened in the interim to lead to this present reality?
It's very hard to overestimate the severity of the internal situation in Israel right now. Certainly in terms of the overall feeling, the overall public sentiment, and the actual steps that the government is taking, this already feels not only like a non-functioning democracy, but actually as a dictatorship in being. And there is a famous booklet by something like Kim LaChapelle, something like that, maybe you know her. It's called Tyranny Under the Guise of the Law. And it's a study in the transformation of democracies to dictatorships or to autocratic regimes. And it lists 8 different stages that are not necessarily linear. They could be taken in parallel. But in any case, the operative number is 8. And the 8th stage is the manipulation of election laws. And all previous 7 steps have already taken place in Israel. And we are now at stage 8, where the government, we're supposed to have elections on November 26th, but it's no longer certain. And most commentators agree that there will probably be attempts to manipulate the elections, to suppress the Arab vote, maybe to outlaw some or all of the Arab parties, and so on and so forth. Just in the last week, Netanyahu was not only threatened to disobey a direct order by the Supreme Court, which is unprecedented in our history. He actually already disobeyed several of them. And on the not so small matter of the firing of the head of Shin Bet, the legendary organization in Israel that is in charge not only of foiling terror attacks from Palestinians and from others, but also for defending Israeli democracy and the rule of law. And Netanyahu fired the head of Shin Bet, and he is compelled by the Shin Bet law that it is the legal responsibility of the Shin Bet to defend the Israel's democratic institution and the functioning of the democratic order. So he was fired by Netanyahu only because of the so-called Qatargate, the ongoing investigation against at least 3 advisors in Netanyahu's innermost circle, and potentially against Netanyahu himself for working with Qatar against Israeli interests and receiving payments, direct payments or indirect payments via all sorts of sub-entities from Qatar, before the October 7th and also during the post-October 7th war, as incredible as it sounds. So Netanyahu used this relatively new investigation to try to politicize the head of Shin Bet and the Shin Bet in general, and to say that, he needs to fire him. He lost trust in this person, allegedly, and he fired him without any due process against Israeli law. This is all this detail is just to say that we are in totally uncharted territory where the prime minister has no hesitations to actively sabotage Israeli democracy, to actively sabotage the Shin Bet that no Israeli prime minister in history dared to play with in this undemocratic way. Because if every potential head of Shin Bet and every potential head of any Israeli organization, and the Shin Bet is one of the strongest and most formidable, if not the most, with the IDF and Mossad, if the heads of these institutions will know that they totally depend on the whim of Netanyahu or any other prime minister, it will completely transform the relationship between the civil service in Israel and the political echelons, and will essentially go a long way to eliminating any degree of independence of the bureaucracy. Netanyahu is pushed to a corner because of his previous criminal investigations and an ongoing trial where he is testifying, and he's trying to delay and to do everything he can, essentially to play for time. And the feeling in Israel, and this is backed by multiple public opinion polls, is that 70-80% of Israelis understand what's going on, are afraid for the future of Israel's democracy, are against Netanyahu and his government and his policies, and actually want early elections immediately. And it's very clear that Netanyahu is not going to listen to the majority of Israelis.
Is there any chance that kind of growing popular pressure, that 80% opposition, is there any kind of chance that could bring down the government?
I'll try to simplify it, but it's not simple. This is not when we have a very different system of government compared to yours. So the normal situation under such circumstances, and this is what happened in previous, to some extent, similar historical circumstances. For example, after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when there was obviously a catastrophic failure by the IDF, by the government, and the entire Israeli public wanted the government to go. Again, the government tried to do everything in its power to keep power, but at some point they were forced out, and they were voted out by essentially by the political echelons. The situation now in Israel is that Netanyahu has a pretty cohesive coalition of 68 members of Knesset out of the 120. And despite of the severity of the situation, and despite of the wide understanding, this is a government that is illegitimate and is even, some would go as far as to say, illegal because of the abrogation of Supreme Court orders, there's no sign of any group or even any single individual out of those 68 coalition members who is willing to vote with the opposition on top of the government in a no confidence motion. So I'm not saying it's entirely impossible, but right now it doesn't look realistic. What is realistic is something that never happened in our history, which is an incapacitation clause that exists in Israeli law and in Supreme Court verdicts, and it's complicated. Again, I'll try to simplify. Incapacitation, the kind of conventional incapacitation, has to do with the health situation of a prime minister. This is what happened with Ariel Sharon when he got a stroke. He was announced as incapacitated, and there was a procedure, and he was replaced by his second in command. This is obviously not the case with Netanyahu, but he is, some would argue, and I personally would argue, already incapacitated for some time, because it is obvious that he's working. Not only is he not serving Israel's interest, he's actively harming Israel's interest in a variety of ways. And he's working against our national interest, against our national security, against the majority of the population. He is also in a systemic abrogation of his conflict of interest agreement that he signed in order to be legitimized by the Supreme Court 2 years ago when he created his government, because he was already under indictment. So he had to sign a conflict of interest agreement where he stated that he will keep his hands off anything that has to do with the legal system, which he obviously didn't do. He did the exact opposite with the entire legal coup and all of the judicial coup. So there are multiple reasons to announce that he is already incapacitated. However, there is no specific clause in Israeli law that specifies how this might happen. There is just a Supreme Court verdict that essentially, again, states shortly and without details that it is within the authority of the Attorney General to announce, under certain circumstances that are not specified, that the Prime Minister has been incapacitated and needs to step down, or even to be forced out of office.
But Netanyahu has also taken steps to try to remove the attorney general, right?
Exactly. That's a major reason why he has done that. The process of firing her has begun. Okay, there is a process. It has to go through a committee. It will take time. But the government essentially decided that she needs to go, that the government also doesn't have trust in her anymore, that she's working allegedly against the government and so on, which of course is all not true, but this is also going on. So as complicated as it sounds, and it is complicated, what might happen, and I want to be careful here, and you will hear different opinions from different people, but what might happen is the following succession of events where, let's say, tomorrow there is a Supreme Court discussion. At some point, within a few days, probably there will be a verdict. If the verdict will be that the firing of the Shin Bet was illegal and it is essentially null and void, and Netanyahu decides not to abide by this verdict, then this is, we don't even have the right wording for it. Some would say it's a constitutional crisis. I would argue it's much beyond that. But at any rate, we're at a situation where there could be a very strong argument to declare Netanyahu incapacitated. This is a declaration that needs to be made by the Attorney General and needs to be confirmed by the Supreme Court. So this is a possible scenario. It's obviously not the only one. The Supreme Court could be intimidated, could try to seek some sort of a compromise with regards to the firing of the head of Shin Bet, for example, to say, to send the two parties to talk to each other and to come to an agreement or whatnot. There are all sorts of creative possibilities here.
Setting aside the legal process that you've laid out just now, are there any other kind of constraints on the government right now? I mean, you mentioned the coalition partners. It sounds like that's not a constraint on anything. But what about the kind of people in the street, the deteriorating economic situation, or the U.S. And that relationship? Do you think any of those kind of play a role potentially here as well?
That's a good question. I would say the situation of the IDF, and specifically the reservists. The numbers of days that reservists have served are already totally unprecedented, on completely different order of magnitude compared to any other wars that we ever had, both in terms of the burden on the kind of the average reservist and in terms of the burden on the overall force. Everybody who knows anything about the real situation understands that this is not sustainable. Not only that, while the government is demanding from the reservists to do more and more and more, and it is not clear exactly what are the war goals right now and what is achievable and what actually these guys that are being sent into Gaza are what is the purpose of the war that they are asked to wage, and there are growing questions about that. And on the other hand, the government continues to exempt the ultra-Orthodox from any kind of obligatory service, something, again, that we don't have time to dive into. It's a long-standing issue in Israel. Various governments have tried to avoid the issue, but now, because of everything that has transpired, there's a huge outrage amongst 80, 90% of Israelis from left, right, and center that are saying this is no longer this is not sustainable. We will no longer stand for the situation where an 18-year-old secular or traditional or national religious person, certainly male, is drafted in a compulsory way to the IDF, and his ultra-Orthodox companion, peer, 18-year-old, is exempted from service. Israelis will not stand for that anymore. And the government understands it, but it is locked in a situation where they have the political commitment of the 68 members of the coalition. So the coalition hinges on them, and they are demanding a total and full exemption. They're not willing to listen to any kind of compromise or whatnot. And on the one hand, on the other hand, the vast majority of Israelis are not willing to for any kind of a compromise, and they're simply saying, there needs to be equality. Everybody needs to serve. Period. And this is not something that the government has really a good answer for. So it's a very serious constraint. Beyond that, you said Trump. You said about the regional situation. Trump is a huge question mark on any issue, including this one. Nobody knows exactly why Netanyahu invited himself to Washington, or even if he invited himself or Trump summoned him. And it's not clear what is going to be discussed. But let's put it this way. If Trump decided that the war in Gaza must end, and he would instruct Netanyahu to end the war in Gaza, the war in Gaza would end immediately. Trump has enormous leverage over Netanyahu that he has so far not used. So in terms of constraints, and obviously if something like that happens, it will create a huge political problem for Netanyahu, because the extreme right will say, we need to get back to fighting. And this could lead Israel into early elections. But I don't think it's very likely that Trump will do that. Anything goes with Trump. I don't know, but
he's notoriously unpredictable. So yes.
Yes. And just a final word on that, while, again, all of this is going on, Netanyahu is also using not only the war in Gaza, but also some other fronts of the war, notably the front in Lebanon and the front in Syria, and the Iranian situation, to essentially keep Israelis in a permanent state of alert and kind of ambiguity and confusion. And Netanyahu continuously kind of pumps a lot of alarmism into the Israeli press that he largely controls. So if you were to read the headlines of Israeli papers yesterday, today, tomorrow, it would be about Iran and about allegedly an impending Israeli attack or Israeli-American attack on Iranian nuclear sites as kind of a cure for that problem, as if it will cure anything. But again, whereas with the Biden administration, somebody like me with knowledge of the issue would say, the Americans are not going to play ball. That's not something I can safely say about Trump. Who's to say?
Yeah, when Netanyahu came to town last time, we got the Gaza Riviera. So I guess we can prepare to expect the unexpected.
So, Eran, you tiptoed right into my next question, my next set of questions. And I'm glad you brought up the issue of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, their ability to maintain the tempo that they've had. And you've talked about the various conflicts in the neighborhood that Israel is engaged in right now. So right now, Israel is carrying out military actions in Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon and in Syria, kind of all at the same time. And you alluded to this a little bit, but I wanted to kind of pull on this thread a little bit more. What are the aims and objectives in each of those cases? And here, I mean, what is the government saying that the objectives are? And on the other hand, what is the actual national security concern or interest that is potentially at play in the background that is playing into some of those decisions? So, taking it one at a time. With Gaza, the ceasefire has fallen a few months back. What is Israel trying to accomplish there right now, and at what point does it hope to achieve it?
First of all, I want to correct you regarding the circumstances of the abrogation of the ceasefire. And I have to say, it pains me to hear every time, and that the framing that Netanyahu injected into the public discourse, not only in Israel but also in America and elsewhere, is totally bogus. The ceasefire did not collapse. There was an agreement, very clear agreement, which Netanyahu hid from the Israeli public. But from what we know, I don't think it is deniable. There was a specific agreement that essentially said, there are three stages. In stage one, there is the release of a certain amount of prisoners for a temporary ceasefire. In stage two, all the hostages will be freed in exchange for more prisoners, and the war will end. There will be a permanent ceasefire, and all IDF forces will withdraw from Gaza, including from the Philadelphia corridor. That's stage two. And stage three is the beginning of reconstruction in Gaza. All of this package was sealed and signed in a bilateral agreement between Israel and Hamas that Netanyahu signed and was guaranteed by the Trump administration and the Qataris and the Egyptians. And Netanyahu decided to abrogate the agreement after phase one was completed and not move to phase two. It was a clear-cut decision by Netanyahu, nothing else, backed by Trump, unfortunately. So it's not a collapse. It's a designed, willful abrogation of an agreement that was just signed by the party that signed it, with the unfortunate backing of the superpower and the president that took so much pride in this agreement. He said, "This is my agreement. Biden would never have reached it. It's only because of me." And then a second later, yeah, sure, you can abrogate it. And again, I'm saying it because most Israelis understand it. Even though Netanyahu is trying to play and to say, well, it's not me, it's actually Hamas that abrogated the agreement or whatnot. But it's very clear what actually happens. And if you ask Israelis, and there are those public opinion polls in Israel, who do you think abrogated the agreement? Or do you think that Netanyahu wants to free the hostages? 60, 70% of Israelis are saying, yes, he abrogated the agreement, and yes, he doesn't want to free the hostages. So that's what's going on. He needs, for his political purposes, he needs the war to continue endlessly and to expand as much as possible, to expand in Gaza, to expand in Syria, to expand in Lebanon, to expand to Iran. That's a strategy. It's clear cut. And he would never have been able to pull it off, certainly against the clear wishes of 70, 80% of Israelis, without the backing from the Trump administration. So that's where we are. I hope I answered your question. I have to say, sorry, you asked about the goals of the war. So let me add another layer here. The government decided at the very early days of the war on certain strategic goals, and it was not able to reach any of them. One was to release all the hostages. Obviously, they chose not to achieve it. Second, to eliminate Hamas's military capabilities and governmental capabilities in Gaza. They were able to significantly harm them, but not to eliminate them. And then to create the conditions for the safe return of all Israelis residents of the Galilee and the north, the safe return to their homes. Also didn't happen. I think only about 20% returned to their homes. They don't trust the ceasefire. They understand the situation is fragile. So out of those three war goals, none was achieved. And what Netanyahu is saying now, this is again as of last week, there was a government discussion, and Netanyahu went out and said publicly that now, in reference to all those demands of him to talk about the day after in Gaza and who is going to control Gaza, something that he has avoided so far, obviously deliberately, now he's saying, and again, he's building on Trump, this ridiculous idea of transferring of 2.3 million Palestinians out of Gaza and the creation of the so-called Riviera in Gaza, that nobody is taking seriously. But Netanyahu last week said, we are taking it seriously. And you asked us all the time, what is the plan for the day after in Gaza? This is the plan. Trump's plan, we're adopting it. This is now our plan as well. And he has created a special organization within the military that is designated with the mission of encouraging the willful immigration of Palestinians out of Gaza. And he's taking all sorts of steps, ostensibly, to advance that new warring. So it's important that people understand this is now the new stated goal of the war.
Syria seems like kind of a unique case, in this list that we've talked through. As much as it can be, it seems the most like a case of mission creep in some sense. What is Netanyahu's goal there, and what is he trying to achieve?
I'd put it this way. First of all, Netanyahu is claiming that the coup in Syria that eliminated the Assad regime is actually his creation, Netanyahu's creation, even though nobody saw it coming. It took everybody by surprise, including our intelligence services, including your intelligence services, and everybody's. But first of all, he's declaring, this is one of the achievements of the war. Secondly, he's defaming and trying to delegitimize the new regime in Syria as an Islamist terror supporting regime. And thirdly, he's trying to create a situation where this new administration, new government is constantly destabilized by Israeli actions in southern Syria, including the actual capture of territory that at first was seen as kind of very ad hoc-ish, temporary, and so on. But now Israel is saying, the defense minister and Netanyahu are saying, we're going to stay there for the foreseeable future, even though, again, it's a clear abrogation of the 1974 separation of forces agreement. So Israel is now controlling the Syrian side of Mount Hermon, which is the highest point in the area, and it is, according to various declarations, essentially saying, we will not allow the Syrian army to execute its sovereignty along Israel's border, at least for now. And again, very recently, yesterday, the day before, there is a new talk about sphere of influence, a direct sphere of influence of Israel in the entire area from the Golan Heights, from the Syria-Israel official border to Damascus, as kind of an Israeli response to the Turkish endeavors to take sponsorship of Syria and so on. And all the time, there are military actions that Israel is taking, not only in the immediate vicinity of the border, but also much deeper into Syria. Most notably, again, just a few days ago, when it was published, and I'm sure the Israeli intelligence services knew about it well in advance, that Turkey is preparing operationally to take control of certain airports, military airports in Syria. Israel bombarded those very same airports and runways in order to prevent Turkey from utilizing them, risking, obviously, a direct confrontation with Turkey, something which is, again, never happened in our history, and I find almost unbelievable. A NATO member, a regional power, the last thing we need is an armed confrontation with Turkey. It's not even imaginable. And again, under any other American administration, this would not have been possible for any Israeli government or prime minister. Any American president would have, a long time ago, would have given the order for the Israelis to stop, would have created a dialogue between Israel and Turkey, even sponsored such a dialogue, because obviously it's in clear American interest. And I believe it's certainly possible for Israel and Turkey to come to agreements about security threats or eliminating security threats to Israel and to Turkey from Syrian soil. And the situation right now in Syria is much better from Israel's perspective compared to when Assad was in power. Iran is no longer there. The armed shipments that constantly ran from Iran via Iraq, via Syria to Lebanon, Hezbollah, are no longer running. Iran became overnight. It was a major strategic partner of Syria, and it became an enemy, which of course plays into the hands of Israel. But instead of using and leveraging this situation for stability and kind of new arrangements in Syria on an agreed basis, Netanyahu is taking a completely different turn, already alienating not only the Syrian regime, but also the Syrian people, risking a confrontation with Turkey. And, it's almost as if he's working against the Israeli interests rather than in favor of it.
Eran, you've spoken obviously about the kind of immediate neighborhood, but looking a little bit more broadly, Israel's relationships in the region have taken a significant hit as a result of the war and everything that you've just described. And that's been true for both longstanding partners like Egypt and Jordan and some of the newer ones like the Abraham Accords countries. Those relationships seem to have been stretched almost to the breaking point in some cases. How is that impacting kind of practical cooperation, and how concerned are folks within the Israeli foreign policy circles about that and the potential impact?
So let's differentiate between the peace agreement parties, which are Egypt and Jordan, and then the Abraham Accords. With Egypt, it's not a secret that there's a very high level of tension between Sisi and Netanyahu and between the two governments. It was true before the so-called Trump idea of transfer, essentially, of 2.3 million Palestinians onto Egypt, mostly, which for Egypt really, I don't want to say it's an existential threat, but from the regime's perspective, it is really the highest threat imaginable to Israel, to Egypt's national security. It touches upon the most sensitive historical, demographic, religious chords of the Egyptian identity. Obviously, with the Muslim Brotherhood as the major threat to the Sisi regime, and with Hamas in control of Gaza, with the history of terror and cooperation between terror organizations across the Egypt-Gaza border, between ISIS and Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and so on. So it's a direct threat, and I'm sure the Egyptians were shocked by this Trump notion. But because Netanyahu aligned himself with this plan, the tensions between Israel and Egypt are now at one of their highest, if not the highest level, since the peace agreement. So that's the first point. The second is that in the context of the negotiations between Israel and Hamas on the ceasefire and hostage release and all of that, Egypt obviously was one of the two regional facilitators or mediators. It was Egypt and Qatar. And there was always a tension between those two countries. There's a tension regardless of the negotiations and regardless of Israel, but obviously it manifested itself in this new context of negotiations, and there was competition between the two of them on who is going to take the lead and positions they took around the table and all of that. And Israel at some point tried to play, if you want, between Qatar and Egypt and inflame the tensions between them and try to elevate the one at the expense of the other and all of that, and alienated further the actually both the Egyptians and the Qataris. But in terms of the relations between Israel and Egypt right now, they're at a very low point. Tensions are high. The risk level is high. One of the things that the police and the Shin Bet are now investigating is a smear campaign against Egypt that was initiated probably by those advisors that are being investigated against Egypt, pertaining that Egypt is actually preparing for war with Israel, that Egypt is abrogating the peace agreement with the numbers of tanks and troops it is inserting into the Sinai against the clauses of the agreement, and so on and so forth. It was a major campaign. It was all around the Israeli media, the Arab media, and American media, including CNN and others. And it was all fake. It was all false, and it is now being investigated. Who actually initiated it and why? Again, it's hard to exaggerate the level of tension and distrust that exists between Israel and Egypt. With Jordan, there's a long-standing tension. Again, the king stopped talking to Netanyahu years ago, and essentially said, I don't believe a word he says. So, and he lied to me so many times. I'm simply not. I'm going to disengage. So he didn't cut diplomatic relations between Israel and Jordan entirely, but there's no strategic dialogue. There's no high-level dialogue between the king and the prime minister. Yes, there is ongoing cooperation, luckily still between the IDF and the Jordanian Defense Forces, which is very important for both countries. And everything that's going on in Syria or in southern Syria also has direct impact on Jordan. And Iran is trying to, some of the arms shipments that went previously via Egypt and via the sea onto Gaza and the West Bank, are Iran has intensified its attempts to bring knowledge and firepower and all sorts of capabilities, malicious capabilities, onto the West Bank via Jordan. So Jordan is under a lot of stress and relations are bad. Regarding the Abraham Accords countries, specifically the UAE, this is the most important one, Morocco, Bahrain, with all due respect, Sudan. The UAE probably has the closest position to Israel with respect to the future of Gaza. And then there's Saudi, that is kind of the ultimate prize for Netanyahu and for any future Israeli prime minister. So I'll wrap up with this, and I think it is not understood and not appreciated enough what the Saudis are actually doing with the so-called the coalition, the global coalition for the implementation of the two-state solution. That's something that Israelis are totally unfamiliar with, and it's not a coincidence. Netanyahu is actively trying to hide it. Essentially, it's a huge coalition of almost 100 countries, including all the superpowers, the Americans, Chinese, Russians, all the Europeans, all the Arab countries, and the Palestinians, but not Israel. Israel was invited and refused, and this was not even reported in the Israeli press. And this is an ongoing effort that started, I think, almost a year ago. There were high-level meetings, already I think 5 of them, and the next one is planned for June in Paris, led by the French and the Saudis. And they're essentially putting together a plan for the implementation of the two-state solution in an unprecedented way in terms of scope and depth and seriousness. I've been following previous attempts, and I think this one is particularly impressive and crucial. And the critical point is this, and now this is my interpretation. It may happen differently, but this is my interpretation. Essentially, what the Saudis are saying to themselves and to others is the following. We made the mistake of allowing the Israelis and Palestinians to quote unquote manage the conflict. We wrongly believed that we can leave those two to quarrel or to manage their relations or whatnot, and it will have no direct impact on our national security. Obviously, October 7th proved, and everything that happened after proved us wrong. So we cannot go back to October 6th. We cannot go back to the doctrine of conflict management, and we can no longer allow Israelis and Palestinians to decide the fate of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and of the region at large. And therefore, we are making this tremendous effort to put together this huge plan and this huge coalition. And once the plan is ready, we will present this plan to the highest levels of all parties, and we will demand a yes or no answer. Conflict resolution based on a two-state solution is no longer viable because they're refusing. So what do we do? And the answer is, and again, that's my interpretation, we will transform the international consensus from the two-state solution to a different one, to a one-state reality. We, the global we, okay, the global coalition. So it will be a momentous point in time. And I think this should be the topic for the next Israeli elections, because Israelis need to understand the criticality of this moment, a decision that almost all Israeli governments tried to avoid. This Israeli government is trying to kind of change the terms of reference of the conflict by implementing this Trump notion of transfer or annexing the West Bank or kind of changing the basic kind of strategic equation between Israel and the Palestinians. I hope and believe it will not succeed. And it will, again, for me, the best possible scenario or the least worst scenario is that there are elections in Israel and the Israeli people are made to understand the full implications of either choosing to go with the Saudi global coalition towards a conflict resolution scheme or face the consequences of a one-state reality. I would very much like, again, the next Israeli elections to be about that and the global coalition to succeed in making clear for both Israelis and Palestinians that, this is the moment. It can no longer wait. We cannot afford another October 7th. We cannot afford, quote unquote, managing the conflict. And that's it. Last word about the Palestinians, because I spoke a lot about the Israelis. Obviously, there are multiple problems on their side. The Gaza situation is horrible. There needs to be part of this solution that the global coalition is devising has to do obviously with Gaza and a Palestinian Arab transitional government that will take over Gaza. There's a huge question about the security situation and who exactly is going to eliminate the remains of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other armed militias, and create a situation where we can move on to reconstruction, and that there are no threats from Gaza towards Israel. It's a huge challenge, but this is one. The other is the Palestinian Authority, that, as the Biden administration said, needs to undergo a very deep and serious reform and upgrading. There are all sorts of words for it. But the problem is it cannot be done via elections at this point in time. I am somebody who always believed in elections in general and also in elections for the Palestinian people. I thought it was an underused resource in order to bring about stability and peace and so on. And I still believe that, but not immediately. If we go for elections now, it is too risky. There's no telling, what the outcome might be. We certainly don't want Hamas or a Hamas proxy to take over. So there needs to be a transitional period. It's certainly true about Gaza. It's true also about the West Bank. I'm not sure exactly how long Abu Mazen will survive. And as long as this Israeli government is in place, it is doing everything in its power to undermine the Palestinian Authority, to annex at least parts of the West Bank. So the situation is very, very fragile. Bottom line, if I were in a position of influence on the Trump administration, I think Trump needs to understand that he's backing the wrong horse and that he has chosen the wrong policy for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And his entire regional policy is totally misguided. You will probably hear that when he goes to Saudi at the end of May, if I remember correctly. And he needs to understand that first of all, Netanyahu is totally unpopular in Israel, and he's not somebody that can bring peace to this country. He's not somebody that has any interest in bringing the war to a close. Quite the opposite, as we said. He's not somebody that is looking to release the hostages. Essentially, his interests and Trump's interests and America's interests do not align. So instead of backing him and giving him, quote unquote, license to kill on 7 fronts, to kill, to transfer, to kill Israeli democracy, he needs to change course radically and align himself with the 70-80% of Israelis that want the exact opposite, want an end to the war, the release of the hostages, will be willing to listen to the Saudi, European, American global initiative for the implementation of a two-state solution, even though it's going to be very hard. And there's going to be a process of rebuilding of trust, of rebuilding of Gaza, of hopefully gradually marching towards the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Israeli-Arab conflict, including normalization between Israel and Saudi, including a new regional architecture. We hardly spoke about Iran and what's going on there. We don't have time anymore, but it's obviously also crucial. And Trump has an opportunity to really rearrange the Middle East in a favorable way from an American standpoint. But that's not something he can get from Netanyahu.
We've covered a lot of ground in today's conversation, but I think that's a good place to leave things there for now. And as you said, we had issues we didn't get to yet, and I'm sure we'll have you back to talk about all of those. But thank you very much, Eran, for joining us today.
Thank you, guys.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can find MEI's latest coverage of Israel and other regional issues on our website at www.mei.edu. And you can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you'll listen in again next week.